Hi folks, hope you're okay today. It's good to see you. We're looking at Answering Islam, this book, and we're looking at the Quran. The book's written by Norman L. Geisler, Abdul Salib, published by Baker, and that's the book that we're looking at. Does perfect preservation prove divine inspiration of the Quran? Critics give a negative answer for several reasons. First, there is often serious overstatement as to the preservation of the Quran. While it is true that the present Quran is generally a very good copy of the 7th century Uthmanic recension, it is not true that this is exactly the way it came from Muhammad. Many lines of evidence can be offered in support of this conclusion. As was already pointed out in chapter 5, the Quran was originally memorized by devout followers, most of whom were killed shortly after Muhammad's death. Accordingly to early tradition, Muhammad's scribes wrote on pieces of paper, stones, palm leaves, shoulder blades, ribs, and bits of leather. Muslims believe that during the lifetime of Muhammad, the Quran was written down, but according to the testimony of Zayd, a contemporary and follower of Muhammad, he was requested by Abu Bakr to search out the various chapters and verses, the Quran, and gather it together. He responded accordingly. I sought out the Quran, I gathered it together from the leafless palm branches and thin white stones of men's breasts. Some time later, during the reign of Uthman, the third Muslim caliph, it was reported that several Muslim communities were using different versions of the Quran. Once again, Sayyid was called in to oversee the official revised version of the Quran. It is this version that he has remained uniform and intact to this day, not any alleged original version that came directly from Muhammad. Two noted European archaeologists, Arthur Jeffrey, wrote a book titled Materials for the History of the Text of the Quran, in which he related the state of the Quran text prior to its standardization under Uthman. It reveals, contrary to Muslim claims, that there were several different texts prior to Uthman's revision. Jeffrey concludes that when we come to the accounts of Uthman's recension, it quickly became clear that his work was no mere matter of removing dialectical peculiarities in reading, as many Muslims claim, but was a necessary stroke of policy to establish a standard text for the whole empire. Further, he adds there were wide divergences between the collections that had been digested into codices in the great metropolitan centers of Medina, Mecca, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. So Uthman's solution was to canonize the Medinan Codex and order all others to be destroyed. Therefore, he concludes there can be little doubt that the text canonized by Uthman was only one among several types of text in existence at this time. In agreement with the general observation, Watt, in discussing the various variations between the two codices, that of Ibn Masud of Rufa and Ibn Kab of Syria, writes, no copies exist of any of the early codices, but the list of variant readings from the two just mentioned is extensive, running to 1,000 or more items in both cases. Recent discoveries confirm the textual corruption of the Quran. J. Smith has documented just how extensive these corruptions have been, thus undermining the traditional Islamic claim of an uncorrupted version of the Quran. Third, contrary to popular Islamic belief, not all Muslims today accept one and the same version of the Quran. The Sunni Muslims accept the Sahih tradition of Masud, one of the few people authorized by Muhammad to teach the Quran as authoritative. Yet the Ibn Masud Codex of the Quran used by them has multitudinous variations from the Uthmanic recension. In the second surah alone, there are nearly 150 variations. It takes Jeffrey some 94 pages to show the variations between the two. He also demonstrates that the variant readings were not just a matter of dialect, as many Muslims claim. For instance, some of the variants involved whole clause, others omit complete sentences. Jeffrey concludes that it is quite clear that the text which Uthman canonized was only one out of many rival texts, and there is grave suspicion that Uthman may have seriously edited the text he canonized. Widely accepted Islamic tradition reveals certain things not found in the present Quran. One tells us that Aisha, one of Muhammad's wives, said among what was sent down of the Quran were 10 well-known verses about suckling which prohibited. Then they were annulled by 5 well-known ones. Then the Apostle of God deceased, and they are what the Apostle of God deceased. They are what is recited of the Quran. Another example of something not found in today's Quran is what Umar said, "Verily God sent Muhammad with the truth, and he sent down upon him the book accordingly." The verse of stoning was part of what God Most High sent down. The Apostle of God stoned, and we stoned after him, and in the book of God stoning is the adulterer's due. This original revelation was apparently changed, and 100 stripes has replaced stoning as the punishment for adultery. Surah 24:2. The so-called satanic verses illustrate another change in the original text. According to one version of these verses, Muhammad had an early revelation in Mecca which allowed intercession to certain idols. Did you consider Al-Hat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, the third of the other? Those are the swans exalted. Their intercession is expected. Their lights are not neglected. Sometime after this, Muhammad received another revelation, cancelling the last 3 verses, and substituting what we now find in Surah 53, 21, 23, which omits the part about interceding to these pagan gods. According to what both versions have been recited publicly, Muhammad's explanation was that Satan had deceived him and inserted the false verses without his knowing it. Claire Tiddle, famous worker among Muslims, points out that even in the Quran there are some variations. Among various readings may be mentioned in Surah 28:40. Some read Sahirani for Sirani. In Surah 32:6, after Ummahatumma, one reading as the words Wahum Abum Lahum. In Surah 34:18, for Rabban Bed, some read Rabuna Beda. In Surah 38:22, for Tisun, another reading is Tisun Atum. In Surah 19:35, for Taruna, some read Yam Taruna. 7. Although Shiite Muslims are in a minority, they are the second largest Islamic sect in the world with over 100 million followers. They claim that Caliph Uthman initially eliminated many verses from the Quran that spoke of Ali. L. Bavan Jones summed up the matter well in his book The People of the Mosque when he said, "While it may be true that no other work has remained for 12 centuries with so pure a text, it's probably equally true that no other has suffered so drastic a purging. The purging took place early, and hence the Muslim claim that it has been preserved perfectly since it is misdirected." I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about that, Muslims, because there's a lot of evidence there to show that the Quran has changed quite a lot.